Good evening. Tonight, we step back in time, not to the gilded halls of emperors, nor the bustling marketplaces of a city at peace, okay? Instead, we journey to the heart of the Roman Republic, to a time of immense power, but also profound injustice. This is the story of a rebellion that shook the very foundations of Rome. A tale of courage, desperation, and the unyielding human spirit yearning for freedom. We will follow the unlikely path of a man named Spartacus, a Thracian warrior, condemned to the life of a gladiator who ignited a spark of hope that became a roaring inferno. From the harsh training grounds of Capua to the strategic battlefields of Italy, we will trace the rise of an extraordinary leader in the army of the oppressed. He led against the mightiest military force the world had ever known. Their quest was audacious, their defiance legendary. Prepare to immerse yourself in the story of Spartacus, the gladiator who challenged Rome. Let the echoes of their struggle guide you through a pivotal moment in history, a saga of courage etched forever in the annals of time. The city of Capua, sprawling and sun-drenched, shimmered in the heart of Campania, a fertile land just south of the vast Roman capital. For those who strolled its public squares or witnessed the lively trade in its markets, Capua was a picture of Roman prosperity and vibrant life. It hung heavy and still, thick with the abrasive grit of the training yard, fine dust that coated everything and settled in the lungs. Beneath it, the sharp, coppery temps of sweat mingled with the faint, almost metallic, scent of old blood, a constant reminder of the ludus's true purpose. He was a Thracian, a proud warrior forged in the rugged mountains of his homeland, where the biting winds swept across wide, open skies. Thrust and parry, feint and block, footwork designed to make them lethal dancers of death. The small indignities, the constant surveillance, the utter lack of agency over their own bodies and destinies, it gnawed relentlessly at their spirits. The air in the ludus, once merely oppressive, began to feel truly suffocating, pressing in on all sides. A deep, silent desperation took root in the hearts of many, including Spartacus. It was a slow-burning fuse meticulously woven into the fabric of their daily torment, ignited by the constant, brutal reminder that their lives were not their own and that their end would be nothing more than a fleeting amusement for strangers. The only question that truly mattered was not if this fuse would burn through to its explosive conclusion, but when and what monumental fury it would unleash upon those who held them captive. The very air seemed to hum with this unspoken tension, a prelude to the storm that was gathering. Every movement, every strike, every step was meticulously honed, stripping away individual personality to forge them into efficient instruments of entertainment and brutal public demise. There was no true joy in this, only the grim, fleeting satisfaction of surviving another drill, another sparring match, of enduring one more day. When the brief reprieve of evening finally arrived and the harsh commands faded, the men would retreat to their cramped, silent quarters. They lay close, their bodies aching from the day's exertions, their minds often replaying the brutal lessons learned or haunted by fleeting, agonizing glimpses of their former lives. A wife's face, a child's laughter, the quiet peace of a home now lost. The only solace of fragile comfort in this despair was the unspoken understanding that passed between them. Silent camaraderie, forged not in friendship, but in the brutal crucible of shared suffering. Each man knew with chilling certainty the fate that awaited him. The deafening roar of the crowd, the blinding sun reflecting off the arena's golden sand, the final desperate fight against another slave, or perhaps against a wild beast, all for the entertainment of Roman citizens. Some clung to the fragile hope that their exceptional skill might one day earn them their freedom, but most knew that even victory in the sands was merely a temporary reprieve, a prolonged sentence, another sunrise closer to their inevitable end. That life, a tapestry, woven with the threads of freedom and personal honor, now seemed an impossibly distant, almost dreamlike memory, replaced by the suffocating confines of Capula's Ludus. His body, once unchained, free to roam the wild forests and high peaks, was now a tool, meticulously molded and hardened by the ruthless discipline of the Roman arena. He was a Murmillo, a heavily armed gladiator, trained to wield a formidable gladius and a large rectangular shield, his strength immense, his endurance legendary. Yet it was not merely his physical prowess that set him apart. His gaze, though often weary, held a profound depth. It was not the vacant stare of the utterly defeated, nor the desperate glint of the broken. Instead, it was a quiet, simmering intensity, the watchful, calculating stare of a man who remembered with painful clarity what freedom tasted like. He absorbed every command, every lesson, every cruel jest, but in his eyes there was a silent promise of something more, something defiant, even as he endured the daily humiliation. The sun, when it managed to pierce the high, narrow windows of the cramped sleeping barracks, offered no warmth, only long, stark shadows that stretched across rows of rough straw pallets. Each pallet was a temporary, comfortable resting place for men who once walked as free individuals, who carried names and histories now largely forgotten, replaced by the grim title of Gladiator. These were not soldiers by choice, but men captured in war, or condemned for crimes, or simply sold into bondage, fought for their raw strength, quote potential skill, or merely their unfortunate circumstance. They were property, their lives dictated by the whims of their master, destined for the sand of the arena, its grand amphitheater, a testament to engineering and spectacle, often roared with the thunderous approval of crowds gathered for entertainment. But hidden beneath this gleaming veneer of civilization, behind walls of thick, unforgiving stone, lay a place where the concept of life itself was stripped bare, reduced to a mere commodity. Here, freedom was a distant, painful memory, and every waking moment was a stark, brutal rehearsal for death. This was the Ludistic gladiatorial training school, owned by the ruthless Lentulus Petitus. Within these cold, oppressive confines, the very air seemed to possess a tangible weight. Each dawn brought with it a piercing, unwelcome shift from a brief, troubled sleep to the harsh reality of their enslavement. The voice of the lanista, the school's master, was a raw, guttural command that sliced through the pre-dawn gloom, a sharp, cutting whip of sound that tolerated no delay. Up, to the yard. Now, move. And with the collective groan of protesting muscles, the shuffle of tired, dragging feet, the men would reluctantly rise. Their bodies, though hardened by endless drills, bore the marks of constant strain. Old bruises, stiff joints, unhealed abrasions. The sounds of the ludus were a relentless, grating symphony of oppression, the dull, rhythmic thud of wooden swords striking against worn, battered shields, a monotonous beat that echoed the ceaseless pounding in their own temples. The harsh exhalation of exertion, the sharp, panting breaths torn from lungs pushed to their limit. And most jarring of all, the metallic jingle of the chains. Even in the frenetic dance of training, the chains were a constant, brutal reminder of their captivity, a cruel melody of their unbreakable bonds. Among these enslaved men stood Spartacus. The hours bled into each other, a relentless, numbing blur of repetitive drills. As weeks turned into an eternity, and months blurred into the desolate stretch of years, the weight of the chains, though literal and heavy on their limbs, became even heavier in the soul. The air in the ludus had become a heavy, suffocating blanket, not just from the oppressive heat of the Campania sun, but from the unbearable weight of desperation that pressed down on every gladiator. Perhaps it was a particularly harsh beating, a taunting word, or simply the cumulative despair of another Capuan dawn. The catalyst arrived not in a grand declaration, but in a sudden, desperate surge. The clash there was fiercer, the sounds heavier. The guards, perhaps better armed with Gladian spears, met the wave with grim determination. But their training had been for order, for control, not for the wild, unpredictable surge of men with nothing left to lose. The sounds of alarm had now spread throughout the entire ludus, drawing more guards, more resistance. The rush of cool evening air, fresh and untainted by the stench of the ludus, was like a revelation. The choice was immediate and stark: scatter and be hunted down, or cling together and fight for a chance. Spartacus, even in this raw chaos, moved with a clear purpose. He recognized the terrain, the looming presence of Mount Vesuvius in the distance. The mountain, a silent giant, offered a temporary sanctuary, a place to gather, to breathe, to formulate a plan. It was not a fortress, but a natural refuge, a place where a small, desperate band could hope to elude the immediate grasp of their formidable enemy. And so, with the sounds of alarm bells now ringing out across Capua, and the desperate shouts of Roman guards hot on their heels, the newly freed gladiators, led by the silent determination of Spartacus, began their urgent trek towards the dark, welcoming shadow of Vesuvius. Each step was a defiance, each breath a taste of a freedom they would fight to keep. The stars, scattered across the vast, dark expanse of the Capuan sky, seemed impossibly bright, a stark contrast to the small, grimy patch they'd seen from their cells. Freedom, a chaotic, terrifying, exhilarating freedom. The gladiators, many of them still bearing the marks of their enslavement, poured out into the night. Their movements still uncoordinated, but their spirits ignited. The air was filled with shouts, the clang of steel, and the heavy thud of bodies hitting stone. But the momentum of the rebellion, once a whisper, was now a roar. The gladiators, fueled by a terrifying surge of collective rage and exhilaration, battered at the gate. Some scaled the walls, dispatching archers. Others, using their immense strength, worked to break the locks and bolts. It was a desperate race against time, as the sounds of pursuit from outside the ludus began to swell, signifying that Rome itself was stirring. Spartacus, moving with the brutal efficiency of a true Thracian warrior, was at the forefront. He moved not with the flashy movements of the arena, but with the raw power and cunning of a survivor. Every swing of his improvised weapon, every block, every push, was a testament to years of suppressed strength finally unleashed. He fought not for an audience, but for the breath in his lungs, for the hope of seeing a sky not framed by prison walls. His presence was a rallying point, his actions a silent command that spurred others onward. A group, perhaps 200 strong, but only a fraction armed with anything more than the blunt practice swords and heavy shields of their training, moved as one. The Roman guards, though disciplined, were overwhelmed by the sheer, unbridled ferocity of men fighting for their lives, for their very souls. As the final resistance crumbled, a small but significant cache of weapons was seized. Real gladi, the deadly short swords of the arena, gleamed dully in the torchlight. Helmets and shields, though heavy and cumbersome for battle outside the arena, were quickly donned. The rags they wore were now adorned with pieces of captured armor, a patchwork of defiance. Now, they were no longer just gladiators. They were an armed, desperate force, a nascent army of the wronged. Their target was not the arena, but the very heart of their confinement, the kitchen, then the armory. The sudden eruption shattered the mundane rhythm of the ludus. Commands from the lanista turned into shouts of alarm, then desperate pleas for aid. The air, already thick with dust, was now filled with the metallic clatter of dropped training weapons and the sharp, gasping breaths of men driven by a single, overwhelming purpose. The shared glances, the grim nods, the almost imperceptible shifts in posture during the brutal drills, all spoke of a silent, growing consensus. The kitchen was the first objective, a chaotic scramble for anything that could serve as a weapon. Knives, usually reserved for carving meat, became crude daggers, their edges honed by hunger and rage. Spits, iron skewers, even heavy cooking pots were snatched up, transformed into instruments of rebellion. A gladiator, eyes burning with a desperate fire, wielded whatever he could find, his movements unrefined by arena combat, but fueled by years of pent-up fury. The first guards, caught unawares, fell quickly, their screams swallowed by the sudden din of the revolt. The small victory, the first taste of active defiance, sent a jolt of electrifying courage through the rebels. They were not just individuals enduring torment, okay? They were a collective spirit, pushed to its breaking point, okay? For Spartacus, the daily grind was no longer just about survival, but about observation. He watched the guards, noted their routines, the shifting of their weight, the moments of their laxity. He studied the layout of the complex, the creak of a distant door, the chinks in the armor of their captivity. The idea, born of whispers and the collective agony of the incarcerated, was no longer a fleeting fantasy, but a hard, cold, desperate necessity. Freedom or a swift end in the attempt. The spark ignited on a day indistinguishable from any other, or so it seemed to the oblivious guards. The initial chaos was raw, unfiltered. Gladiators, trained to fight one another in controlled spectacles, now turned their disciplined fury against their oppressors. From the kitchen, the next brutal step was the armory, a place guarded with more diligence. But now, confronted by an unstoppable wave of desperate men, the battle for the armory was swift and decisive. The next obstacle was the main gate, a thick, reinforced barrier that represented their ultimate confinement. Finally, with a protesting groan and a splintering crack, the main gates burst open. The immediate aftermath on the road was a scramble. They were free, but utterly exposed. The sounds of Roman pursuit were close, growing louder. The frantic dash from Capua had been a desperate scramble, a chaotic burst of energy fueled by adrenaline and the sheer, intoxicating shock of newfound, albeit fragile, freedom. As the last glimpses of the city's distant, alarmed lights faded behind them, the escaped gladiators, now a ragged, growing band, found themselves pushing towards a dark, looming silhouette on the horizon, the formidable peak of Mount Vesuvius. This wasn't a strategic fortress, nor a planned refuge. Word of the gladiators' audacious escape had reached Rome, sending tremors of outrage and a dismissive scorn through the Senate. They were, after all, mere slaves, an irritation to be quickly suppressed. He walked among his men, not with grand speeches, but with a quiet, observant presence. He studied their faces, their weariness, their fading hope, and he studied the mountain. They stood, shaken but resolute, in the thick, overgrown ravine, undetected. The Roman camp, expecting no threat from this quarter, was entirely unprepared. The screams of alarm were immediate, shrill and chaotic, shattering the morning stillness. Roman soldiers, roused from sleep, stumbled out of their tents, disoriented and vulnerable. The gladiators, fueled by days of hunger, fear, and the sheer audacity of their escape, fought with a savage fury. This was not a fair fight, but a rout. The sounds of desperate Roman pleas, the clatter of dropped weapons, and the thud of bodies hitting the cold earth filled the air. Glaber's forces, composed of ill-disciplined militia, crumbled rapidly under the surprise assault, their lines breaking, their formations dissolving into a panicked flight. The silence of their successful escape was almost louder than any noise they could have made. Weapons, armor, food, and even horses, all became the spoils of the rebels. They had not only survived an impossible siege, but had decisively defeated a Roman force, however small. They had outsmarted their oppressors, demonstrated incredible courage, and gained valuable resources. More importantly, they had found a true leader in Spartacus, a man whose ingenuity and unwavering resolve had turned terror into triumph. The legend of the gladiator rebel began to echo across Campania, a whisper of defiance that would soon become a thunderous roar. This victory on Vesuvius solidified their purpose, proving that even slaves could wield power and that the fight for freedom had only just begun. Above them, the Roman camp remained oblivious, their fires still flickering, their sentries pacing the one path they knew. But Spartacus had found another. He led his men, moving silently through the dense undergrowth, carefully navigating the unseen obstacles in the dim light. Their target was the Roman camp itself, now vulnerable and unsuspecting. His gaze constantly returned to the sheer, precipitous cliff face on the side of their encampment that the Romans deemed impassable, a vertical drop, seemingly insurmountable, leading down into a tangled, overgrown ravine. It was this impossibility that sparked an audacious, desperate idea in his mind. The slopes of Vesuvius were covered in wild vines, thick and resilient, twisted ropes of nature. An idea began to form, a daring, almost insane gamble. Thus, they dispatched a small, hastily assembled force, not a legion of seasoned veterans, but local militia and auxiliaries, numbering perhaps 3,000 men. They began the painstaking, secret work of collecting the strongest, longest vines they could find. The plan was simple in its concept, terrifying in its execution. The gladiators, still weary but now gripped by a renewed, desperate hope, gathered at the edge of the sheer cliff. One by one, with hushed breaths and trembling hands, they began their descent. The sounds were muted, the soft rasp of rough vine against stone, the quiet creak of stretched fibers, the low, steadying murmurs from those above. Each man grasped the makeshift ropes, placing his trust not only in the strength of the vines, but in the unwavering determination of the man who had conceived this impossible feat. They moved like silent specters, a living ladder of desperate humanity, inching their way down the terrifying vertical drop, leaving behind the Roman trap. Hours passed in this agonizingly slow, dangerous descent, punctuated only by the occasional dislodged pebble tumbling into the unseen abyss below. Under the cover of darkness, they would carefully test their strength, knot them together, and conceal them. The work was slow, laborious, requiring immense care to avoid detection by the Roman patrols, whose distant voices sometimes drifted up the mountainside. The very air seemed to hum with a quiet tension, the silence broken only by the rustle of leaves as they worked, or the faint, almost imperceptible grating of rock as a carefully placed foot found purchase on the treacherous terrain. This was the true genius of Spartacus, not just strength in battle, but an innovative mind that saw opportunity where others saw only an impassable barrier. Up their head was Praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber, a man more accustomed to the comforts of Roman politics than the rigors of mountain warfare. He approached Vesuvius with an air of casual confidence, convinced he would swiftly sweep this nuisance from the slopes and return to his duties. His men, arrayed in neat Roman ranks, began to encircle the base of the mountain, establishing a rudimentary siege line, blocking the single known path down. From their elevated vantage point, Spartacus and his growing band watched, the gravity of their situation settling heavily upon them. They were trapped, but a natural, imposing sanctuary, its slopes offering a temporary shield from the immediate fury of Rome's pursuit. The Roman camp, a disciplined array of tents and watchfires, glowed faintly in the plains below, a constant, mocking reminder of their confinement. The gladiators, now numbering perhaps 700 or 800, scavenged what they could from the volcanic slopes, wild berries, roots, and what little game they could snare. Water, a precious commodity, was carefully rationed from sparse mountain springs. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and the biting cold of the mountain nights seeped into their bones. Whispers of doubt began to ripple through the camp. They had escaped one prison, only to find themselves ensnared in another, higher up, with no apparent way out. The Romans, confident in their superior numbers and their unbreakable siege, simply waited, assuming starvation and thirst would do their work. They knew of only one path up and down the mountain, and they held it firmly. The trek was arduous, a relentless climb over rough terrain, through thickets of unfamiliar brush, and over loose volcanic rock that shifted treacherously beneath their worn sandals. The only sounds were the heavy, ragged breathing of men unaccustomed to such sustained marches outside the confines of Ludus, the rustle of leaves in the night wind, and the occasional sharp snap of a dry twig underfoot. The ascent was slow, methodical, driven by the knowledge that every upward step meant another foot of distance from their enraged captors. As dawn hesitantly broke, painting the eastern sky in muted grays and soft pinks, the rebels finally found a precarious footing on a large, relatively flat plateau high on Vesuvius's slopes. It wasn't an ideal encampment. The ground was uneven, studded with ancient, gnarled trees and volcanic debris, but it offered a commanding view of the plains below, a vital advantage. Weariness, bone-deep and pervasive, settled over the group. They slumped against rocks, their muscles screaming, their breaths still ragged. Some shared meager rations of stolen bread, a quiet communion of desperate men. The initial rush of freedom had given way to a stark realization. They were free, but also stranded, isolated on a dormant volcano, armed with a haphazard collection of stolen gladiatorial weapons and kitchen implements. Yet, there was a new, palpable sense of purpose in the air, a quiet resolve hardening their features. They had chosen to fight, and fight they would. Below, on the verdant plains, a new presence began to materialize like a slow, inevitable tide. The days that followed were a testament to the grim reality of a siege, but Spartacus was not a man to surrender to despair. Quietly, meticulously, Spartacus gathered a few trusted men. The night of the escape arrived, a moonless canvas of oppressive darkness that offered both concealment and peril. As the first faint streaks of pre-dawn light began to touch the eastern sky, painting the world in shades of gray and silver, the last of Spartacus's forces reached the bottom. The attack was a brutal, sudden shock. From the unexpected direction of the ravine, Spartacus and his new reinvigorated gladiators burst forth like a vengeful torrent. By mid-morning, the battle was over. The Roman camp, once a symbol of their entrapment, now lay in disarray, its tents plundered, its meager supplies seized. The dust of Vesuvius, still clinging to their sandals and the rough fabric of their cloaks, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, replaced by the richer, darker soil of Campania's fertile plains. The audacious victory against Praetor Glaber's forces had done more than merely provide a vital cache of weapons and supplies, had ignited a wildfire that swept through the hidden corners of Roman society. Yet, it was an authority that remained deeply rooted in the shared experience of suffering, not in inherited rank or decreed power. He was one of them, intimately familiar with the gnawing pangs of hunger, the biting cold of unsheltered nights, and the crushing weight of Roman chains. And arrogant in its contempt for these rebel slaves, was now slowly beginning to grasp the escalating, terrifying threat. Praetor Publius Varinius, a man of greater military experience and higher standing than the disgraced Glaber, was dispatched with a larger, more formidable force. His mission clear: to swiftly redeem Rome's tarnished honor and restore order. One particularly striking victory came when Varinius's own lieutenant, Lucius Furius, attempted to corner a segment of Spartacus's rapidly growing army. The Senate, once dismissive and scornful of the slave revolt, now felt a cold, unsettling tremor of genuine fear. And his remarkably fair leadership spread like wildfire among the oppressed, creating a powerful, almost religious fervor. He was rumored to distribute spoils equitably among his men, to discourage unnecessary cruelty, and to embody the simple, powerful ideal of a leader fighting solely for freedom, not for personal gain or conquest. This magnetic aura drew even more followers to his banner, a steady, unceasing stream of men and women from all corners of Italy, from hardened veterans of the Roman legions, forced into slavery, to the downtrodden and the desperate, all seeking a taste of the liberty he promised. His camp, no longer just a makeshift refuge, became a sprawling, temporary city of the dispossessed, a vibrant, if chaotic, community of individuals united by a single, burning purpose. The sounds of its constant growth were woven into the very fabric of the landscape, the hammering of tent stakes into the earth, the murmur of hundreds of voices conversing in dozens of different languages and dialects, the crackling of cook fires under the stars, and the rhythmic, unceasing practice drills that never truly ceased. It was a powerful testament to the fact that even in the heart of Rome's power, a storm was brewing, a mighty uprising driven by the simple, profound desire to break free from the chains that bound them. The vast plains of Italy, once solely Rome's undisputed domain, now vibrated with the formidable, growing presence of Spartacus's army. A challenge that could no longer be ignored, a shadow stretching longer and longer across the very heart of the Republic. A gladiator, a Thracian slave, was not only leading a rebellion, but was consistently outmaneuvering and humiliating their seasoned legions, one after another. The sounds of alarm bells now echoed not just in the immediate vicinity of Capua, but across the entire vast, seemingly unshakable Roman Republic, reaching even the gilded palaces of Rome itself. The very idea of slaves, the very bedrock of their luxurious society, rising up and winning against Roman might was an unthinkable heresy, a direct existential threat to the entire social and political order upon which Rome was built. The fear was palpable, a chilling, persistent whisper in the opulent villas and a nervous murmur through the crowded forums. Spartacus, with an almost uncanny intuition for Roman tactics, sensed the impending trap. He feigned a disorganized retreat, luring Furious's confident Roman forces into a carefully chosen, constricted ambush point. The Romans, overconfident and perhaps still underestimating their foe, found themselves suddenly and brutally ensnared, their disciplined lines breaking under the furious, unexpected assault that erupted from all sides. The sounds of their confusion, their mounting panic, mingled with the triumphant roars of the rebels. This was not just another defeat for Rome. It was a profound embarrassment, a stinging blow to their formidable, almost mythical military reputation. The captured Roman standards, the abandoned equipment, the scattered bodies of Roman soldiers, all were stark, undeniable testaments to the growing power and strategic genius of the rebel army. He commanded not one, but 2 full legions, a truly formidable sight of gleaming armor, meticulously arrayed ranks, and the purposeful march of seasoned soldiers. The clash was inevitable, a collision of order and chaos, of the cold, calculated might of the Roman war machine against the fiery, desperate passion of newly armed rebels. Spartacus, ever the cunning strategist, chose his ground with meticulous care, often using the natural terrain to his immense advantage, just as he had done on the slopes of Vesuvius. He avoided open-field engagements where Roman legions, with their rigid discipline and superior numbers, held an undeniable, crushing advantage. Instead, he employed daring ambushes, swift, brutal hit-and-run tactics, and sudden, overwhelming strikes that caught the Romans off guard, shattering their formations and sowing panic within their ranks. He understood the silent language that passed between men who had endured too much, the subtle shifts in gaze, the weary slump of shoulders, the burning fury hidden behind tired eyes. There was the heavy, jarring thud of shields colliding, the sharp rasp of gladius against pilum, the pained cries of men, both Roman and rebel. But interwoven into this brutal tapestry of sound was the desperate, unified, almost primal roar of the rebels. It was a sound born not of training, but of men fighting not for coin or glory, but for their very lives, for their families, for the fundamental, unalienable right to exist as free beings. Each victory, however small in the grand scheme of Roman might, was a jolt of electrifying energy through their ranks, a lightning bolt that solidified their unwavering belief in Spartacus and the impossible dream he embodied. With each triumph, they seized more Roman weaponry, donning captured helmets and breastplates, equipping themselves with stronger, sharper gladi. They transformed themselves, bit by agonizing bit, from a desperate rabble into a truly formidable fighting force, clad in the very symbols of their former oppressions. The sight of these once slaves, now arrayed in the armor of their former masters, was a powerful, terrifying symbol to the Romans, a horrifying inversion of their natural order. His presence among them was a steady, immovable anchor in the swirling chaos of a rapidly expanding, largely untrained, and incredibly diverse force. His commands, when given, were clear, concise, and infused with an inherent understanding of their capabilities and limitations. His strategies were sharp, born of an innate military cunning. His gaze, unwavering and direct, met each man's eyes, instilling a trust that few others could command. He embarked upon the monumental task of forging this motley collection of individuals, bound by little more than their shared oppression, into something resembling a cohesive, disciplined fighting force. Word, carried by clandestine whispers and the furtive glances of slaves in fields and villas, spread with a speed far greater than any Roman courier could achieve. They drilled with captured Roman swords, heavier and more balanced than their gladiatorial blades, their newly acquired shields offering a different kind of protection. They learned to move in formation, to hold a line against an imagined enemy, to execute precise maneuvers as a unified body, to march with purpose. The sounds of their practice were no longer the muffled, confined thud of the ludus yard, but the wide-open, resonant clang of metal on metal, the rhythmic stomp of hundreds, then thousands of feet on open ground, the guttural shouts and coordinated cheers of men learning to fight, not for entertainment, but for their very survival, for the fragile dream of a life lived free. Spartacus, along with his most trusted lieutenants, the fierce Gauls, Crixus and Enemos, who themselves were respected gladiators, instilled a discipline born not of fear, but of a shared, desperate purpose. They understood and imparted to their burgeoning army that their individual strength, however great, was utterly meaningless without collective action, without the unwavering solidarity of men fighting as one. Every morning, as the sun climbed above the distant Apennine mountains, its golden rays would fall upon 1,000 men, then 2,000, then 3, practicing their movements, their synchronized charges, their defensive formations, their faces set with a grim but unshakable resolve. The air, crisp and fresh with the distant scent of pine and wild herbs, now carried the determined, pulsating energy of this growing uprising, a palpable tension of a brewing storm. The impossible had happened. Enslaved men, mere gladiators, men considered less than human, had not only escaped, but had decisively defeated a Roman army. The whispers of defiance that had long simmered beneath the surface of Rome's vast, stratified social order now surged into a roaring chorus, a symphony of desperate hope that resonated from the most opulent estates to the smallest, most desolate farmsteads. From every corner of the vast, wealthy Italian countryside, they began to come. Not just gladiators, though many more joined from other brutal ludus scattered across Italy, their faces etched with the same grim determination. They were joined by runaway slaves from sprawling Roman villas, their backs and limbs bearing the visible, often gruesome, scars of relentless manual labor, their spirits burning with a quiet, yet fierce, desire for retribution against their former masters. Shepherds, their faces weathered by sun and wind, abandoned their lonely flocks on distant hillsides, drawn by the tantalizing promise of true freedom, a liberty they had only ever dreamt of. Farmers' generations tied to the land, but now pushed to the brink of utter destitution by ruthless Roman landlords and crushing debts left their meager plots, their hands still calloused from the soil, their faces grim with a quiet, unwavering resolve to seek a better fate. Even free men, impoverished and disenfranchised by Rome's relentless expansion and ruthless political machinations, joined the swelling, ranks, seeing in Spartacus not just a rebel, but a champion for the oppressed, a singular beacon of justice in a world consumed by power and greed. Each new arrival, whether journeying alone through the shadows of night or arriving in small, furtive groups under the cloak of dawn, brought with them not only their hopes and their grievances, but also a diverse array of invaluable skills, a profound knowledge of the land, an instinctive talent for foraging and survival, or simply a raw, untamed courage born of desperation. The army that formed around Spartacus was a living, breathing patchwork quilt of human suffering and defiance, a chaotic yet deeply unified testament to Rome's own deeply ingrained fundamental factors. Spartacus, now firmly established as their undeniable leader, moved through this burgeoning, desperate community with a newfound authority. The training began in earnest, not within the suffocating confines of Eludis, but under the boundless, indifferent expanse of the Italian sky. The first true test of their burgeoning strength came swiftly for Rome. Though initially dismissive, the sounds of these early battles, though still sharp and sudden, were distinct from the controlled, almost ritualistic clashes of the arena. The audacity of Spartacus's strategic mind seemed to know few bounds. The news of these humiliating, unthinkable defeats rippled through Roman society like shockwaves emanating from a deep, unseen fault line. Meanwhile, Spartacus's reputation soared to mythical proportions. Stories of his strategic brilliance, his unwavering courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The reverberations of victory over Verinius' legions echoed not just across the plains of Campania, but deep within the swelling ranks of Spartacus' army. Their triumph had cemented his position as an unassailable leader, a figure of almost mythical stature to the thousands who now flocked to his banner. It was an unwieldy beast, certainly, but one animated by a singular, burning desire for liberation. However, as the numbers grew, so too did the complexities. Not all who joined shared Spartacus's ultimate vision. Crixus, with his brutish strength and hot-headed temper, vehemently argued for remaining in the south. He argued with a calm, rational logic that cut through the passionate cries for plunder. The departure from Campania was a slow, deliberate exodus. The terrain here was more challenging. Rocky outcrops, dense forests that offered both concealment and impediment. Sometimes the path led across wide, open plains, where the sun beat down with an unrelenting intensity, and the dust rose in blinding clouds with every step. At other times, they navigated narrow, winding valleys, the air cool and damp, the sounds of their passage echoing off the verdant slopes. The olive groves and vineyards of the south gave way to denser forests, two rolling hills that grew increasingly rugged. The air took on a sharper, cooler edge, hinting at the distant, formidable presence of the Alps. The dream of freedom, once a distant light, felt closer now, tangible. But so too did the awareness of the immense distance they still had to cover and the colossal power that was undoubtedly mobilizing behind them. The weight of their past, the threat of their pursuers, and the promise of an uncertain future all pressed in on them. They forded rivers, their waters often cold and swift, the crossing a slow, painstaking process involving ropes and the collective strength of hundreds. Crixus, always driven by a more direct, vengeful impulse, would occasionally argue for turning back south, for seizing the riches of Rome's heartland. The murmurs of dissent would rise, a dangerous undercurrent in the vast army. But Spartacus, through a combination of his immense personal authority, his strategic acumen, and his unwavering focus on the ultimate prize of liberty, consistently steered his diverse force toward the north. He knew that for all their victories, for all their growing numbers, their ultimate strength lay not in their ability to fight, but in their ability to break free from the very system that had enslaved them. Every step northward was a step closer to that impossible, yet essential goal. The dust-choked roads of Italy continued to bear witness to the grinding progress of this extraordinary army, a force unlike any Rome had ever faced. steadily advancing towards a distant, glimmering hope. The sounds of rushing water, mixed with the shouts of men struggling against the current and the creak of improvised rafts, became a temporary soundtrack to their relentless march. The logistical nightmare of feeding, watering, and maintaining discipline within such a vast and diverse army became Spartacus's constant preoccupation. Every day was a masterclass in improvisation. Scouts ranged far ahead, seeking out sources of water, identifying safe encampment sites, and watching for Roman patrols. Foragers fanned out, harvesting grain from abandoned fields or bartering with cautious local villagers. The army moved like a force of nature, consuming resources in its wake, leaving behind a trail of disruption and fear. The vast column, stretching for miles, was a breathtaking and terrifying sight. The sounds of their movement were immense, the rhythmic thud of thousands of sandals and bare feet on the dusty roads. The creak of hastily constructed wagons laden with salvaged supplies, the murmur of a countless throng of humanity. These were not the full, overwhelming might of Rome, but frustrating thorns in their side. Spartacus, ever vigilant, met these skirmishes with swift, decisive action. He would often use his army's overwhelming numbers to encircle and rout these smaller forces, sending them fleeing in disarray. The sounds of these minor clashes were sharp and brutal, quick bursts of violence that reminded his men of their dangerous reality, but always concluded with another Roman retreat, leaving behind abandoned supplies and renewed rebel morale. Horses, requisitioned from Roman estates, neighed, and oxen, pulling their heavy loads, load in complaint. Above them, the sun, ever present, beat down relentlessly, baking the dusty paths. The air, hot and heavy, was filled with the sense of sweat, unwashed bodies, with smoke from countless cook fires, and the rich, earthy smell of the countryside they were traversing. He spoke of the endless tide of Roman legions, of the Republic's limitless resources, of the futility of trying to conquer Rome with a disparate army of freedmen. His voice, though not booming like Crixus's, carried an undeniable weight, born of conviction and strategic foresight. He painted a picture, not of endless battle, but of true liberty, a life where they would never again fear the lash or the arena. Slowly, painstakingly, he swayed the majority. The choice was made. The path lay north. Why flee, Spartacus? He would bellow, his voice resonating with the raw power of a lion. We have tasted victory. The riches of Campania lie before us, ripe for the taking. Let us plunder. Let us exact vengeance. Let us show these Romans what true fear is. Many of the Gallic and Germanic contingents sided with Crixus, their eyes gleaming with the prospect of unbridled reprisal. They had suffered greatly, and their desire for immediate, tangible vengeance outweighed the more abstract concept of a distant, bloodless freedom. Many of the Gauls and Germans, particularly those under the command of Crixus, harbored a fierce, visceral desire for vengeance against Rome, and an inclination to plunder the rich southern Italian towns that lay temptingly within reach. Their eyes were fixed on immediate gratification, on spoils and retribution, not on an arduous march toward a distant, uncertain freedom beyond the Alps. The camp, once a desperate huddle on Vesuvius, had blossomed into a vast, sprawling settlement, a temporary city housing the dispossessed. Its borders expanded daily, absorbing new waves of runaway slaves, impoverished farmers, and even Roman deserters, all drawn by the siren song of freedom. The sounds of their burgeoning numbers were constant, the guttural murmurs of a dozen different languages, the clatter of hastily assembled forged tools, hammering captured Roman metal into new weapons, the rhythmic grind of grain being pounded for bread, and the distant, ever-present cadence of men drilling under the watchful eyes of Spartacus and his most trusted lieutenants. With each passing week, the army swelled, becoming a colossal, living entity. It was this fundamental divergence in goals that brought Spartacus to a critical crossroads. He saw clearly that to linger in Italy, to engage in a war of attrition against the endless legions Rome would inevitably send as a path to certain eventual annihilation. Their strength lay in their unity of purpose, in their agility, and in their ability to strike swiftly and disappear. Prolonged conflict, a war of conquest on Roman soil, would only play into Rome's hands, allowing their vast resources and superior organization to eventually crush the rebellion. His vision, stark and clear, was not conquest, but escape. He proposed a monumental undertaking to march the entire army north, through the heart of Italy, past the formidable Roman legions, towards the distant Alps. Beyond those towering snow-capped peaks lay Gaul, a land not yet fully absorbed by Rome, a place where many of his men could melt away into the forests and mountains of their ancestral homes, forever free from the yoke of Roman bondage. The decision was met with a chorus of debate, a cacophony of dissenting voices within a sprawling camp. But Spartacus, with his quiet, unwavering authority, held firm. And so, the greatest slave army in history began its epic, arduous march. Their path took them through the undulating hills of Samnium, a region steeped in ancient Roman conflict, where the shadows of forgotten battles still seemed to linger. They swept through Picenum, then pressed into Umbria, their route taking them through a mosaic of landscapes. Along this northward journey, they encountered various Roman forces, smaller legions, and militia dispatched to harry their flanks, to slow their progress, to test their resolve. As they pressed further north, the landscape began to change, subtly at first, then more dramatically. The internal tensions, though largely managed by Spartacus's powerful leadership, never entirely vanished. The reports filtering back to Rome from the plains of Italy were no longer mere dispatches of minor skirmishes or isolated banditry. They were increasingly urgent, increasingly terrifying accounts of outright defeats. The Senate, accustomed to receiving news of conquests and triumphs, now found itself gripped by a cold, unsettling fear. In the crowded forum, where once the orator's voice had been the loudest sound, now there was a pervasive murmur of anxious speculation. In the early months of the new year, the Roman Senate took the unprecedented and drastic step of dispatching not one, but two consular armies to quell the uprising. From every corner of Italy, legionaries were recalled to their standards. Their scouts, ranging far and wide, brought back increasingly alarming reports. The Roman forces they now encountered were larger, better equipped, far more disciplined than the disheveled armies they had so decisively defeated in the south. Crixus, still advocating for a fight to the death and plunder in the south, found his arguments gaining more traction among those who saw the endless march north as futile. A significant contingent of Gauls and Germans, weary of the continuous journey and longing for the comforts of easier plunder, began to separate from the main force. Their desire for immediate vengeance and spoils outweighed Spartacus's long-term vision of total liberation. This split, a painful rupture within the unified front, presented a new internal challenge to Spartacus's leadership. Even as the external threat mounted, he watched them go, a grim understanding etched on his face, knowing that their departure weakened his overall force, but also understanding that he could not force men to fight for a freedom they did not fully comprehend. The encounters grew more frequent, the Roman pursuit more relentless, their formations more formidable. To their front, the elusive promise of the Alps, still so far away. To their rear, the relentless, disciplined pursuit of Rome's consular armies, now determined to exact a terrible vengeance for the humiliation they had suffered. The feeling of being hunted intensified with each passing day. The very ground seemed to vibrate with the impending clash. Spartacus knew that the time for small skirmishes was over. The true war against the full might of the Roman Republic had finally arrived. The vast plains and rolling hills of Italy would soon bear witness to a conflict that would determine not only the fate of his army, but perhaps even shake the very foundations of the Roman world. The air grew heavy with anticipation, a silent tension that promised a storm unlike any seen before. The air, once filled with the hopeful murmurs of escape, now carried a new, chilling undertone of the impending storm. Spartacus, with his keen strategic mind, understood the implications. Rome was no longer merely irritated. Rome was truly afraid, and a frightened Rome was a dangerous, ruthless enemy. The sounds of Rome's true military machine awakening were distinct and formidable. The rhythmic tramp of thousands of marching boots on cobbled roads, the clatter of heavy armor, the sharp, disciplined commands of centurions, the distant blast of trumpets signaling formations. These sounds spoke of an unstoppable force, meticulously organized engine of war. The air around the military camps, which sprang up like mushrooms outside the city walls, was thick with the scent of leather, oiled metal, and the earthy aroma of thousands of men gathering for a grim purpose. The eagles, sacred standards of the legions, gleamed dully in the pale winter sun, symbols of Rome's unwavering determination to reclaim its authority. These were no hastily assembled militias. These were the very backbone of Rome's military might, commanded by the consuls themselves, Lucius, Gellius, Publicola, and Gnaeus, Cornelius, Lentulus, Cludianus. These men were veterans, seasoned commanders, backed by the full weight and discipline of Rome's legions. The open plains, once their highway to freedom, now felt like a vast arena where they were the hunted. The sounds of their own massive army, once a comforting roar of unity, now mingled with the distant, ominous sounds of Roman legions on the march. The disciplined cadence of their advance, the occasional sharp blast of a cornu horn slicing through the air. The vastness of Italy, which they had traversed with such daring, now seemed to shrink around them, the net closing in. The hope of a clean escape over the Alps began to feel increasingly fragile. It's a distant glimmer against the encroaching shadow of Roman might. Their appointment signified a complete shift in strategy. Rome was now fully committed to obliterating the rebellion, sparing no expense, no effort. Whispers of Spartacus became common, uttered with a mixture of fear and, for some, a reluctant awe. The wealthy landowners, whose vast estates in the south were now vulnerable to the rampaging rebel army, clamored for immediate, decisive action. Senators debated fiercely, their voices echoing through the hallowed halls. But beneath their dignified rhetoric lay a growing panic. This was no longer just about restoring order. It was about preserving the Republic's very image of invincibility, its control, its perceived divine right to rule. The humiliation of Verinius and Glaber still smarted, a raw wound on Rome's military pride. The casual disdain with which they had initially regarded the slave revolt a fleeting nuisance to be crushed by a local praetor had curdled into genuine alarm. A gladiator, a Thracian slave, a man they considered to be utterly beneath them, was not only leading an army of the dispossessed, but was consistently outmaneuvering and humiliating their legions. The very fabric of Roman society, built upon the foundation of a vast slave economy, felt a tremor beneath its feet. The political climate in the Eternal City grew tense and agitated. The gravity of the situation demanded a response far grander than mere Praetorian forces. The muster of these consular armies was a spectacle of immense scale and chilling purpose. For Spartacus and his army, moving through the northern reaches of Italy, the change in the wind was palpable. The landscape itself seemed to bear witness to this intensifying hunt. Internal tensions, ever present in such a diverse army, began to surface with renewed intensity. The path ahead was now fraught with peril on all sides. The defection of Crixus and his Gallic and Germanic contingents had been a grievous wound to Spartacus' grand vision of escape. Their desire for immediate plunder and vengeance, their inability to grasp the long-term strategy of freedom beyond the Alps, had caused a painful, irreparable rift. As the main body of Spartacus's army continued its northward march, albeit with a heavy heart and a diminished force, news reached them of Crixus's fate. He did not waste time with grand speeches or public boasts. The dream of the Alps, once a beacon of hope, now receded. He turned his army southward, moving towards the very toe of Italy, the rugged, mountainous region of Bruttium. The rhythmic thud of thousands of spades digging into the earth, the clang of hammers driving timber stakes into the ground, the shouts of Roman engineers directing legions of laborers, the constant rumble of carts carrying earth and rock. He had marched thousands of miles, endured countless battles, and overcome impossible odds, only to find themselves utterly ensnared. His mind, always racing, immediately sought a solution, a weakness in this seemingly impenetrable cage. He attempted desperate measures to break through the newly constructed barrier. He ordered his men to try to fill the ditch, to scale the wall, to find any breach. The sounds of their frantic efforts, the scrambling, the straining, the frustrated cries mingled with the mocking jeers of the Roman sentries atop the wall. Each attempt, born of desperation and courage, was met with disciplined resistance from Crassus' vigilant legionaries. Arrows rained down, stones were hurled, and the sheer height and strength of the Roman fortifications proved insurmountable. The harsh reality settled in. They were truly trapped. The dream of freedom, so tantalizingly close, now seemed to vanish behind an insurmountable wall of Roman earth and timber, leaving only the bitter taste of utter desperation. The heavy silence of their confinement was punctuated only by the distant, mocking sounds of the sea, just out of reach. The sight of the massive wall, stretching endlessly across the landscape, reaching the very edges of the sea, was demoralizing beyond measure. The sounds that now surrounded them were no longer just the distant murmur of Roman camps, but the continuous, mocking sounds of Roman construction, a testament to their inescapable fate. They were caught, cornered like wild animals, their backs to the Strait of Messina, a sea that now seemed an impassable, shimmering prison wall. It was an engineering feat of astonishing scale, a testament to Roman ingenuity and their terrifying ability to mobilize vast resources. Every day, the wall grew higher, the ditch deeper, becoming an impassable barrier, a physical manifestation of Rome's iron will. The air was thick with the scent of freshly turned earth, sawdust, and the sweat of countless legionaries working with relentless discipline. His intention was clear: to cross the narrow Strait of Messina into Sicily, an island rumored to be fertile ground for another slave uprising, a potential sanctuary where he could regroup, rearm, and perhaps even build a more lasting kingdom of freedom. The arduous march through Bruttium was a desperate push, the terrain harsh and unforgiving, the sounds of their tired footsteps on rocky trails, the groans of the weary, and the constant murmur of a vast multitude filled the narrow valleys. The air here was drier, often smelling of wild herbs and distant salt from the sea, a sea that now represented their last, best hope. His first act upon taking command was chilling and immediate. He knew Spartacus's objective, and he moved with astonishing speed and precision to cut off his escape. His plan was audacious, immense, and terrifyingly effective. As Spartacus's army reached the southernmost tip of Bruttium, nearing the very edge of the Italian peninsula, they encountered not a Roman army, but a colossal, man-made barrier stretching from coast to coast. Crassus had ordered the construction of an enormous defensive line, a formidable wall of earth and timber, punctuated by watchtowers and fronted by a deep, wide ditch, a fossa. This immense barrier, nearly 35 miles long, effectively sealed off the entire peninsula, trapping Spartacus's army in the narrow, rugged landmass of Bruttium. A small cohort of his own soldiers, who had shown cowardice in a previous minor engagement, were subjected to decimation. This ancient, brutal Roman punishment involved executing 1 out of every 10 men in the disgraced unit, chosen by lot. The screams of the condemned, the thud of the axe, the terrified silence of the survivors. These sounds resonated through the entire Roman camp, sending an unmistakable message. Crassus would tolerate no insubordination, no fear, no failure. His legions became a hardened, efficient, utterly terrifying machine. Their movements precise, their discipline absolute. The air around Crassus' forces now hummed with a grim, methodical efficiency, a palpable sense of unwavering purpose. His splintered group, indulging in a brutal campaign of plunder and Apulia, had been cornered and utterly annihilated by the forces of the Roman consul Lucius Gellius Publicola. The sheer, desolate silence that followed this grim news in Spartacus's camp was heavier than any cry. A stark reminder of the terrible cost of division, a chilling premonition of Rome's ruthless capacity for retribution. This tragic loss, however, only solidified Spartacus's resolve. His gaze, often distant and contemplative, now held a renewed intensity. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the dream of freedom for his remaining army rested entirely on his ability to outmaneuver the unrelenting, terrifying might of Rome. The Roman Republic, meanwhile, had had enough. The humiliation of repeated defeats by a slave army was unbearable, a stain on their military honor that demanded a swift, brutal cleansing. Scanius, Gilius, and Lentulus, despite their recent victory over Crixus, had proven themselves incapable of coordinating to defeat the main rebel force. It was time for a new hand, a far more formidable presence. This task fell to Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was not merely a general. He was one of the wealthiest men in Rome, his ambition as vast as his fortune, and his patience as thin as a new coin. He was a man who understood power, both in the forum and on the battlefield. And he approached the problem of Spartacus with a cold, calculated ruthlessness that chilled even his fellow Romans. He saw this rebellion not just as a military threat, but as an opportunity to secure immense prestige and political power. Crassus was granted an army of unprecedented size, 6 new legions comprising some 30,000 hardened Roman soldiers, meticulously trained and exceptionally disciplined. Spartacus, reacting to the mounting Roman pressure from both Gellius and Lentulus in the north, was forced to change his strategic direction. But Crassus, with his relentless strategic mind, anticipated this move. The sounds of his construction must have been deafening, a relentless cacophony that echoed across the landscape for weeks. For Spartacus and his men, the realization of Crassus' trap was a moment of chilling despair. Spartacus, however, was not a man to succumb to despair. The towering, impenetrable wall that Crassus had meticulously erected across the narrowest stretch of the toe of Italy had transformed the rugged, ancient land of Brittum into a vast, inescapable prison. The sounds of its construction, once a distant, mocking cacophony of hammers. It was a land renowned in Roman lore for its immense fertility, its sun-drenched plains yielding abundant harvests, its strategic ports bustling with trade. These were the opportunists, the outcasts, the criminals who thrived in the unseen cracks of the Republic, the notorious Cilician pirates, an agonizing movement towards the very edge of the strait. From their formidable vantage points, high on the Brudden Hills, overlooking the trapped army, the Romans watched with cold, unwavering vigilance, their patience infinite, their confidence growing with each passing day of rebel inaction. They knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the gladiators were slowly starving, slowly freezing, slowly succumbing to the devastating psychological toll of their confinement. Despair, like a virulent, insidious disease, began to spread unchecked through the vast, suffering camp. He maintained his relentless pressure along the great ditch, his legions patrolling with unceasing diligence, their movements precise, their morale high. Even in the face of such overwhelming betrayal and the pervasive despair that threatened to engulf his entire army, his personal resolve remained miraculously unbroken. He moved among his men, a solitary figure of grim determination, his very presence a quiet, unwavering challenge to fate. He tried to rally their flagging spirits, to rekindle a flicker of hope in the deepening gloom that surrounded them. But even he knew, with chilling clarity, that their options were dwindling to nothing, vanishing like smoke into the harsh winter air. The vast Roman armies of Crassus hemmed him in from the north, an unbreachable wall sealing them off, and the treacherous, pirate-infested sea now irrevocably blocked their escape to the south. The chill of despair was pervasive, a cold hand clutching at every heart. But somewhere, deep within the strategic mind of Spartacus, a final, desperate, and audacious plan began to form. It would be a gamble of unimaginable odds, a final, defiant act against the colossal empire that sought so mercilessly to crush them. The only path left was through the Roman lines, a desperate charge for freedom, or to die gloriously in the attempt. The stage was now irrevocably set for their ultimate confrontation. The sounds of their suffering mingling with the distant, ominous rumble of Rome's approaching, inevitable vengeance. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the gladiators were slowly starving, slowly freezing, slowly succumbing to the devastating psychological toll of their prolonged confinement. He could hear the muffled sounds of their growing desperation, carried on the wind that swept across the fossa, the increasingly fewer sounds of training drills, placed by the increased sounds of hacking coughs, the low, mournful murmurs of despondency, and the hollow cries of hunger. The net was tightening inexorably, pulling taut around them, drawing them ever closer to their inevitable demise. Anger, raw and undirected, flared into desperate arguments, into small, brutal skirmishes among the various factions, each seeking an outlet for their unbearable frustration and grief. The dwindling supplies, already stretched impossibly thin by the sheer numbers of the army, now became critically, terrifyingly scarce. The soldiers, already bone-weary from constant marching, endless fighting, and the psychological toll of their confinement, now faced the crushing realization that their only viable path to freedom had been cruelly, cynically snatched away. Hunger became a constant, gnawing pain in their bellies, a relentless ache that drained their strength and clouded their minds. The biting winter winds, sharp and unforgiving, swept down from the Breton mountains, bringing with them a frigid cold that seeped into their very bones, gnawing at their resolve. Without proper shelter, without sufficient food, the once indomitable army that had defied Rome now found itself locked in a desperate, losing battle against the invisible, relentless enemies of starvation, exposure, and a profound, soul-crushing hopelessness. Crassus's legions maintained their disciplined watch along the great ditch, their constant patrols a reminder of the unbreakable barrier, their distant watchfires gleaming like malevolent eyes in the darkness. The air often carried the faint, chilling sounds of their organized activities, a stark contrast to the growing despondency in the rebel camp. Among the ranks of Spartacus, the initial surge of desperate hope that the pirate agreement had ignited slowly, agonizingly, began to curdle into annoying, pervasive anxiety. Whispers began again, but this time not of defiance, but of doubt, of treachery, of the bitter taste of betrayal. Had they been abandoned? Was this just another cruel trick of fate, another layer of suffering piled upon their already unbearable burden? They converged upon the rocky, unforgiving shores of the swirling, unpredictable waters. Their faces, once grim with battle, now etched with a fragile, almost palpable hope. The ships did not come. The vast, empty expanse of the strait remained devoid of any pirate sails. The Cilician pirates, true to their inherent nature, had taken the immense payment in gleaming silver and heavy gold, the collective hope and last resources of the rebel army, and vanished without a trace into the vast, indifferent expanse of the Mediterranean Sea, betraying Spartacus and his desperate, trusting army. The crushing blow of this betrayal was not merely financial, it was existential. It was the shattering of their last, best hope, the merciless extinction of the final, fragile glimmer of light at the end of their seemingly endless tunnel of suffering. A collective groan, a guttural sound of utter, profound despair, rippled through the ranks of the trapped army. It wasn't a roar of anger, but a sound of resignation, a sound of spirit breaking. Silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the immeasurable weight of shattered dreams, extinguished hope, and the bitter taste of utter powerlessness. The air was thick with the tangy, invigorating scent of salt, carried inland on the damp, cool breath of the sea breeze. The sounds that enveloped them were immense, a testament to their sheer numbers. In desperate anticipation, the restless, anxious murmur of thousands of voices, speaking in a dozen different tongues, each conveying the same desperate yearning. There was the constant, shifting grind of countless feet on the pebbled beaches and loose, volcanic rock, the distant, mournful cry of gulls circling high above, and the ceaseless, powerful roar of the powerful currents within the strait itself, a constant reminder of the unpredictable natural barrier that separated them from their dreams. They established temporary sprawling camps along the coastline, their eyes fixed, day after agonizing day, on the distant, hazy horizon, straining their weary sight for the first glimpse of the pirates' promised fleet. Each sunrise brought with it a fragile surge of renewed anticipation, a collective holding of breath, while each sunset, painting the sky in fiery hues, brought with it a creeping, insidious dread that the ships would simply not come. These were not men bound by any code of honor or allegiance, but by the cold, hard glint of coin and the tantalizing allure of opportunity. Their ships, sleek and swift, their sails often black and ominous, plied the vast, lawless expanse of the Mediterranean, engaging in a lucrative trade of plunder, extortion, and illicit transport for anyone willing to pay their exorbitant prices. Negotiations began, fraught with an almost unbearable urgency and existential peril. Spartacus, through trusted intermediaries, offered them a king's ransom in gleaming silver and burnished gold, spoils meticulously gathered and jealously guarded from their hard-won victories over Roman legions. He offered promises of future riches, of a secure, unmolested haven for their illicit trade on an island potentially controlled by a victorious slave army, a new market for their nefarious goods and services. The pirates, their eyes gleaming with unabashed avarice, listened, weighed the staggering sum, and, after a period of agonizing suspense, finally agreed to the terms. The sounds of these secret parleys were hushed, tense, conducted in hidden, rocky coves, under the impenetrable cloak of a moonless night. The rhythmic, hypnotic lapping of the waves against the shore, the only impartial witness to their fateful pact. But most importantly, for the desperate thousands trapped on the mainland, Sicily carried a potent, resonant history. It was the ground where two of Rome's largest and most brutal slave revolts had previously ignited, a place where the seeds of rebellion had found fertile ground and briefly blossomed. Spartacus understood this historical precedent. He knew that if he could somehow transport his vast, weary army across the turbulent, unpredictable waters of the Strait of Messina, they could regroup, rearm with the island's resources, and perhaps even ignite a new, grander, and more enduring rebellion, far from the suffocating, vengeful grasp of the Roman mainland. The decision was born not of ambition, but of dire, immediate necessity, a final, desperate roll of the dice in a game where the stakes were life or unimaginably cruel death. But crossing the strait, a turbulent gauntlet of swirling currents, required ships, dozens, perhaps even hundreds of vessels, and they possessed none save for a few crude fishing skiffs, incapable of transporting even a fraction of their numbers. And shouts had long since faded into a grim, oppressive silence that now hung heavy over the rebel camp. Every desperate, frantic attempt to breach the colossal fossa, the deep, wide ditch, and accompanying formidable earthworks, bristling with sharpened stakes and manned by unyielding Roman discipline, had met with absolute failure. Arrows had rained down in thick, deadly volleys, stones had been hurled with bone-shattering force, and the sheer height and structural integrity of the Roman fortifications had proven tragically insurmountable. The brutal, agonizing reality settled like a shroud upon Spartacus's army. They were irrevocably cornered. With the vast, shimmering, merciless expanse of the Mediterranean Sea stretching out before them, it was an enticing blue-hued promise of escape. Yet it remained an ultimately impassable barrier, its endless horizon mocking their confinement. Hope, once a roaring fire, had dwindled to a fragile, flickering ember, now coalescing entirely around one final audacious gamble: the distant, hazy silhouette of Sicily. The island of Sicily, its low-lying hills sometimes visible as a faint smudge on the distant horizon when the air was clear, offered a tantalizing, almost mythical promise. Word was dispatched through the clandestine, shadowy networks of those who operated perpetually beyond the stringent laws of Rome. And so, the vast, suffering army, a multitude numbering perhaps 60 to 70,000 souls, began its slow, deliberate. The wait was an eternity of agonizing suspense. Time stretched, taut and slow, under the unrelenting pressure of dwindling supplies and Crassus's tightening noose. Then, as the days blurred into an indistinguishable, agonizing sequence of endless waiting, as weeks stretched into what felt like an eternity, the crushing, inescapable realization dawned with the harsh light of a new, empty morning. The aftermath of this betrayal was immediate, palpable, and devastating. Crassus, ever vigilant and patient, with his cold, calculating efficiency, sensed a profound shift in the rebel camp. Spartacus, however, was not a man to succumb to despair, not while a single breath remained in his body. The chilling, desolate weeks that followed the Cilician pirates' betrayal had driven Spartacus's army to the very brink of annihilation. Trapped within Crassus's colossal, man-made barrier across the toe of Italy, facing relentless hunger, the biting cold of an unforgiving winter, and the crushing despair of shattered hopes, their numbers dwindled. The once mighty roar of their collective will had been reduced to a ragged, desperate murmur. The sounds were muted by the swirling snow and the howling wind, but the effort was Herculean. Crassus, enraged by their audacious breakout, unleashed his legions. Rome, now terrified by the audacity and persistence of the slave general, had called upon its most celebrated commanders. He had brought his army to the fertile lands near the Silarus River, a place that would forever bear witness to their final, desperate stand. It was not a tactical engagement. It was a desperate, bloody slaughter. He moved with a ferocity born of desperation and an unyielding will, an almost mythical figure amidst the chaos. He rode his horse deep into the Roman ranks, his eyes fixed on one man, Crassus. The slave war had shaken Rome to its very core, forcing the mighty republic to confront its vulnerabilities and the profound injustices upon which it was built. Spartacus became more than a man. He became a powerful, timeless symbol. He was the gladiator who dared to challenge the invincible, the slave who chose freedom over chains, the warrior who briefly forged an army from the oppressed and made Rome tremble. His name, spoken in hushed tones of admiration and fear, echoed through history. He became an inspiration for countless future rebellions, a beacon of hope for the downtrodden, and a perpetual reminder to the powerful that even the most oppressed can rise. The memory of Spartacus, the gladiator who made Rome tremble, lives on, a testament to the unyielding human spirit's eternal yearning for liberty. The sounds of his rebellion may have faded into the annals of history, but the echo of his fight for freedom resonates to this very day. He fought with a singular purpose, cutting down every Roman who dared to stand in his path. He swung his sword with a strength that belied his weariness, his movements a desperate dance of defiance. The sounds of his personal battle were sharp, brutal, the clang of his blade, the cries of his Roman adversaries. He killed 2 centurions with his own hands, pressing relentlessly forward, a human battering ram against the Roman lines, but the odds were insurmountable. He was surrounded, overwhelmed by the sheer tide of Roman soldiers, a lone, incandescent flame in a gathering darkness. He fought to his last breath, striking down foes even as he fell, his final moments shrouded in the chaos of battle. His body, valiant in death as it had been in life, was never recovered, lost forever amidst the carnage. leaving behind a profound mystery and an enduring legend. The legions of Crassus, fueled by vengeance and the promise of glory, crashed against the rebel lines like an unstoppable wave. The remaining rebels, leaderless and broken, were hunted down without mercy. The aftermath was a chilling testament to Rome's unforgiving wrath. Along the length of the Appian Way, the great road leading from Capua to Rome, Crassus ordered the crucifixion of some 6,000 captured survivors. Their silent, agonizing agony lined the road for miles, a horrifying, macabre spectacle designed to strike terror into the hearts of any who dared to dream of rebellion. The sight was meant to be a warning, a final, definitive statement from Rome that such defiance would never again be tolerated, and that the order of the Republic would be violently, irreversibly restored. The only sounds for miles were the creak of timber under the weight of crucified bodies and the mournful, chilling whispers of the wind. The sounds were deafening, overwhelming, the metallic clang of steel on steel, a continuous, horrifying cacophony of gladiator against shields, spears against flesh, the shouts of commands, the desperate cries of the wounded, the guttural roars of men locked in mortal combat, all merged into a single, terrifying roar. Dust, kicked up by thousands of frantic feet, mingled with the spray of blood, turning the ground into a muddy, gruesome mire. He made no attempt to flee, no effort to prolong the inevitable. Instead, he turned to face his enemies, choosing to meet his fate on his own terms. His last remaining forces, a fraction of their former numbers, but still united by their unwavering loyalty to him and their desperate dream of freedom, prepared for the battle that would end it all. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension, a heavy silence before the storm, broken only by the nervous shifting of feet and the quiet murmur of prayers in a dozen different languages. From the north, news came that Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, the renowned victor over Sertorius in Spain, was returning with his formidable legions. From the east, Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus, fresh from his triumph over Mithridates, was landing his victorious forces in Brundisium. Spartacus was trapped again, not by a ditch, but by the overwhelming, converging might of three of Rome's greatest generals and their seasoned armies. The sounds of approaching Roman legions now came from multiple directions, the disciplined tramp of thousands of boots, the resonant commands echoing across the landscape, the glint of distant armor catching the sun like 1,000 menacing eyes. The realization settled in. There would be no escape now, only a final, climactic confrontation. The chase was relentless, a grim, determined hunt across the rugged terrain of Lucania and into the fertile plains of Apulia. Spartacus's army, though free of the ditch, was now exhausted. Their supplies utterly depleted, their numbers further reduced by the brutal breakout and the unforgiving winter. They moved like a phantom, leaving a trail of weary footsteps, perpetually pursued by the unyielding might of Rome. The sounds of their march, once purposeful, now carried a distinct note of desperate weariness, a continuous, hurried shuffle on endless roads. His men, shivering, but fueled by a desperate, renewed surge of willpower, gathered what little timber they could find, broken tools, salvaged wagon parts, even the last dying embers of their campfires. They hurled branches, earth, and anything else they could find into the deepening, snow-filled ditch, creating a precarious, treacherous bridge across the icy chasm. It was an agonizing, silent struggle against the elements and against time. Some used their own bodies, throwing themselves into the freezing abyss to provide a crude, temporary platform for those who followed. It's a horrifying testament to their absolute desperation and unwavering loyalty to the cause of freedom. The sounds were guttural, choked, the scrape of boots against ice, the soft thud of bodies hitting snow, the strained grunts of men pushing against the impossible. Slowly, painstakingly, a desperate few, then dozens, then hundreds, scrambled across, clambering over the makeshift bridge, their bodies numb with cold and exertion. The vast majority, following their indomitable leader, managed to breach the fossa, leaving behind the silent, snow-covered proof of their desperate measure. They had escaped Crassus's trap, but at a terrible, unquantifiable cost, leaving many behind, swallowed by the ditch or succumbing to the brutal cold. The Roman legions, disciplined and well-fed, maintained their vigilant watch along the enormous fossa, their presence a constant, mocking reminder of the inescapable cage. The air over the rebel camp hung heavy with the scent of wood smoke, struggling against the damp, cold earth, mingled with the unmistakable, growing odor of unwashed bodies and encroaching despair. It was clear that to remain was to perish, slowly and agonizingly, by starvation or Roman capture. Even in the face of such overwhelming odds, was not a man to surrender. His mind, always racing, found a desperate, almost suicidal, sliver of opportunity. The winter nights grew colder, the winds more fierce, bringing with them not just a bone-chilling chill, but also a rare, unexpected gift, a heavy snowfall. The snow, thick and unforgiving, blanketed the ground, and more crucially, began to fill Crassus's meticulously constructed ditch. It was a perilous, fleeting chance, a desperate gamble against insurmountable odds. Under the deepest, darkest cloak of a moonless, blizzard-swept night, Spartacus ordered the final, audacious breakout. Their escape was discovered by the Romans at dawn, setting off a new, furious pursuit. Then, the final, inescapable pincers began to close. Spartacus, with the grim clarity of a man facing his ultimate destiny, understood. The final battle erupted with a shattering roar, a chaotic symphony of violence unlike anything seen before. Spartacus, true to his legend, was at the very heart of the maelstrom. The Roman victory was absolute, brutal, and swift. But though the rebellion was crushed and Spartacus's body never found, his spirit endured.